Umoya Ulight, Umoya Upright. Welcome to another episode of Black Wednesdays. Sorry to everybody for letting you down in last week Wednesdays. I know you guys were looking forward to it. We saw people complaining that it wasn't on, but we do have our elder back where we need him. And that is Steve, we really missed you last week. And we are happy that we are back at school and we can continue the lessons. Dumela and that.
Hela, man. And good evening to the viewers. Ntiki, I think a couple of things that, we are going to focus on today. And, last week's conference at University of Limpopo was quite an eye-opener. I think it helped in very many ways. It offers the opportunity to examine what we have been looking at, since the beginning of this series. And what we have been looking at is what has been the fate of the Black radical tradition in South Africa. And I think we've covered a great deal of ground, trying to explain that. And this is yet another opportunity to demonstrate, what actually happened over the past 40 years. In fact, this week on Sunday is quite significant in a number of ways. One of the topics that we dealt with was the state of emergency of 1985, which P.W. Botha instituted on the 20th of July. So I was meant to speak on the state of emergency of the 20th of July 1985. But the other theme was actually on the Freedom Charter. But I want to focus on, because there's a convergence here, just in terms of what we have been dealing with. I think chronologically, we are around 1985, because we have covered the exile politics, if you may call it that, right down to the Nkomati Accord. And we've explained the circumstances that led to the Nkomati Accord. So in a sense, I think we have explained, what the fate of the June 16 detachment would have been, inside MK. I'm just hoping that people will be able to make that connection, because in that sense, it is the June 16 detachment that we had been talking about. So when we get to 1985 and to the state of emergency of 1985, part of what we have to think about is what the state of emergency was a response to, or what was it actually attempting to preempt? And those are the two questions that we have to deal with. And to answer those questions, we will have to look at, the terrain, the political terrain, of the few years preceding 1985, and try to find an answer there. Was P.W. Botha instituting the state of emergency to deal with the kind of political crisis, if we may call it that, that white supremacy was faced with at that point in time? Now, to answer that question, you may have to begin with, the recent political events of the few preceding years. And I did explain what these were. I talked about the outbreak of, popular violence, and that's how we actually characterized, that political eruption. That what it led to was popular violence, in which there were a lot of organizations, both national and local, that were involved in political contestations. But the issue here is, what is it that the state of emergency was responding to? And if it was responding to internal unrest, we are then talking about that moment when unrest broke out in the Vaal townships, of Sebokeng and Sharpeville. But was it to a certain extent responding to a threat that was coming from outside? I think we touched on that, quite extensively the last time out. But just in terms of P.W. Botha and the kind of propaganda, that he was actually propagating at this time, P.W. Botha would have argued or maybe given the impression that total strategy was actually aimed at dealing with what he said was total onslaught, that the Eng was about to unleash on white supremacy. We've talked about, the kinds of things that the MK Eng, axis would have done to substantiate Botha's claim that there was a total onslaught waiting. And if the viewers will remember, I think I did point out to very key, events that took place in that 7-year period. The Silverton siege, or we may even start with the Koch Street shooting that involved Solomon Masangu. Then you get to the Silverton siege. You get to the, Church Street shooting of 1982. Then McBride's Magoo bombing in 1982 as well. And finally, the final, kind of onslaught on white supremacy would have been the Toti bombing that actually involved 17-year-old Andrew Zondo. Now, those are the kinds of things that P.W. Botha would point to substantiate his claim of an ANC, MK kind of total onslaught that was about to be unleashed on white society. But here's an issue that I actually brought up the last time out, and I really need to emphasize this. In singling out the ANC as the bearer of the total onslaught, P.W. Botha was deliberately excluding the PAC. In all communications, you don't get any reference at all that the PAC is yet another threat to white supremacy in South Africa, which to a large extent, may explain the reason why the PAC would feel that it has been fairly undealt with, just in terms of its exposure, and that it may have been doing things that were actually not accounted for. But that would have been the situation, at least, at any time between 78 and 85, when P.W. Botha instituted the state of emergency. But in focusing on the ANC, one might cynically say that P.W. Botha was actually becoming a public relations manager of the ANC, because he was far more, fascinated and probably even determined to establish the ANC as a serious threat. Now, the question here becomes whether the ANC was as much a threat, as P.W. Botha wanted to suggest. But there was another reason for this, and I probably didn't touch on this, quite extensively. During this period, this is the time when, in fact, I actually refer to the 1980s as the decade of the wars of propaganda. And this was not only true, for ANC and the South African white supremacy state, but it was also true for Washington and Moscow. The whole kind of contestation that was unfolding in the 1980s was actually based on propaganda. So propaganda actually became a very, powerful tool that was used, in the contestations during that decade. So when the ANC adopts what it calls armed propaganda campaign, this is deliberate. This is using propaganda, and it is not quite discriminate about whether the propaganda is in fact a reflection of what is happening or whether it is a tool of disinformation. But the ANC can always claim, that it was its armed propaganda that mobilized, Black people or society inside South Africa. And they will point to, yet again, the upheaval that started in the Vaal townships of Sebokeng and Sharpeville as the outcome, of the armed propaganda campaign of the 10-year period between 1976 and 1985. I hope this makes it quite clear so that people can understand the basis of what we have today. Historically, where do the power dynamics that we have today actually emanate from? What has been romanticized and what has been a true reflection, of what had happened. So, but here we are talking about, what happens in 1985. And by 1984, P.W. Botha was able to comment, and this was after the Nkomati Accord, that his total strategy may have been imperfect, but at least it worked. And by that, he actually meant he probably had neutralized the external threat that the ANC would have posed. This was based on the understanding that much of the armed propaganda campaign and the cross-border operations that happened, between 1976 and 1985, actually emanated from Mozambique. So if you take Mozambique out of the equation, you are actually taking away a great deal of that initiative, because as I pointed out, it is a well-known fact, that the Western Front wasn't as easily accessible, as the Eastern Front would have been. So 1985, comes in that context, in a context in which white South Africa, white society in South Africa is a little more, at rest, that external threat has been dealt with. But the issue here is that it is not the external threat that was immediate to white society at the time. What was immediate was what white society experienced in the 1970s. And I think I pointed out a number, of incidents, which actually would have generated a great deal of fear in white society, which I believe had been deliberately played down, both by the state, by the white supremacy state, for its own agenda, but also by the more powerful liberation struggle formations at the time. And the ANC actually stand out here. And that is the violence that actually came out of the Soweto uprising. This time, not directed at Hector Peterson, but this time directed at whiteness itself. And that would have been the brutal killing of Edelstein. Now, we don't know as Black people on this other side of the racial divide what the impact of that would have been in white society. But quite clearly, this was quite impactful. This actually did, impact on white society in ways that we could never have imagined. Now, even before 1976 was out, it may be that the attack, which was, in fact, this is what it was. It was an attack on a whites-only restaurant at Carlton Center. And this was initiated by Wellington Chazivani. Now, that in itself, the fact that we don't even tell that story has a great deal to do with the fact that, this is the way things are. We play down those kinds of things because, they don't quite, serve the doctrine that we want to pursue. And that doctrine is a quest for a non-racial outcome. Now, beyond that, what we have would be the Koch Street shooting. And again, there, I have actually explained that we have erased Monty Mutloum completely, from the historical narrative, precisely for the same reasons. And then we get to the Silverton siege. And again here, the Silverton siege, I've explained, did not only end on the 25th of January 1980, but its impact reverberated, right down to 1982. And I've explained the ways in which Washington actually responded to the Silverton siege in ways that, other historians may not even want to, to countenance. But that, in fact, is the fate of the Black radical tradition, that so much can be said, about what actually happened in Silverton on that day. But part of what we get here is that the documentation is being done by people with completely different kinds of agendas. And 1980 is only 5 years away, from the state of emergency instituted in 1985. But we want to see and put this to a test. Was it an accumulation of all these things that led to the state of emergency? That's what we are going to have to work out here. And we've talked about those that happened in 82 at Shed Street and McBride and right down to Enruzondo. So that was the situation, just in terms of, where armed struggle as one of the pillars of the liberation struggle movement was at the time when the state of emergency was instituted. But was the state of emergency responding to what was happening inside the country? I always have to explain that in the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday, there was quite a political lull and an extended one at that. You don't have quite a significant outbreak of unrest in South Africa. You do have, a number of local kinds of eruptions, particularly on the East Rand. And here in the PWV area, which has become Gauteng, it was the East Rand that was more turbulent, a little more restless. And, you did have some, local kinds of eruptions leading up to 1985, but which, from time to time would actually be undermined by the state until, you had one major one in Duduza on the far East Rand. And we shall come back to that because it is going to be absolutely critical, to explain the state of emergency. But I did explain the last time out, that you would never have had the popular violence of 1984 to 1983, having the kind of intensity that it had, if you did not have in this equation the IFP, because the IFP, more than anything else, would have intensified the violence of the time. But more importantly, the IFP was also being weaponized by the white supremacy state, to deal with any unrest or any kind of liberation struggle initiative. And for that reason, I have always, given this caution that although in official terms, we assume that the popular violence would have started in 1984 in the Vaal and probably ended in 1993 when negotiations were far advanced. In actual fact, we need to stretch it 1 year earlier and start with the massacre at Ngoye University. The fact
That is Steve.
that
That is Steve.
yeah.
Sorry. What I find amazing is that the Vaal always comes up as the Vaal is quite a for the struggle and for Black people, the Vaal seems to be a national key point. How come there isn't more done around the Vaal? How come it's not so obvious that that everything is coming from the Vaal? And why is everything coming from the Vaal?
Nziki, it is interesting. I mean, very quickly, if we think about it, I think also, it has to do with precisely, this thing that I'm explaining. If what I'm talking about is the Black radical tradition, and what I'm demonstrating is that it was in the interest, of, more powerful, kinds of forces inside South Africa, that the Black radical tradition be suppressed and be suppressed effectively. Now, it may well be, that the white supremacy state would have worked hard to achieve that outcome. But at the same time, you do have, and here we will have to be frank about this, you do have the politics of Ukongolos or the Congress Alliance, which was also heavily invested in the suppression of the Black radical tradition, the outcome of the Vienna uprising and what happens thereafter, is quite evidence, of how much invested the Congress tradition was in the suppression, of the Black radical tradition. And coming back to the Val and to Sharpeville in particular, when you think about the mass movement of the 1950s, historians would like us to believe that during this decade, the 1950s, the ANC actually became a mass movement. It may well have been, because for much of that period, there was no PAC. The PAC is only founded in 1958. But here is a revision of that history that is based, on historical evidence that is available and which has to be read, in a particular way as to rescue, the Black radical tradition of the 1950s, which at the time goes with the label Africanist. So when we talk about the Black radical tradition of the 50s, and we talk about Robert Sobukwe and Eshbim Da and Josiah Mazunya, as the custodians of that Black radical tradition, the label here is they are Africanists. But what you get in the 1970s, despite contestations, it is in fact the continuation of that Africanist tradition as the Black radical tradition of the Black consciousness movement. Now, whether that is true or not is something I am prepared to debate. Now, let's get to the 1950s and what they culminate in. The 1950s culminate in the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. So you do not separate the massacre of 1960 from the mass movement of the 1950s. And yes, for the better part of that decade, the ANC was in fact the mainstream, liberation struggle formation until 1958 when the PAC is formed. But a closer examination of the history from 1950 onwards will demonstrate that inside the ANC, from that point onwards, you had Africanists, who in 1949, when they adopted the program of action, made sure that the program of action was going to reflect a radical Africanist paradigm in the 1950s. But this never happened. That radical option was actually hijacked by non-Africans inside the ANC. And the most instrumental in that hijack was Yusuf Dadoo, who spent the entire decade dominating all discourses inside the ANC at the time. In the 1954 conference, he actually points at Eshbim Da, telling the delegates that those sitting there are black fascists. Now, it shows the extent to which there was an attack on this Africanist tradition of the 1950s that becomes the Black radical tradition in the 1960s and 70s. Now, all of that happens in the 1950s, culminates with Sharpeville, and you have the Sharpeville massacre. Now, the Sharpeville massacre comes out of, a township with a historical experience that would have produced that kind of resistance and reaction to the white supremacy state. I always argue that the anti-pass march that precipitated Sharpeville could have happened in Tsakane in Brakpan, could have happened in Kwatema in Springs. It could have happened in Mohlakeng, precisely because those communities had that shared urban experience that exploded in Sharpeville on the 21st of March, 1960. So having said that, Sharpeville actually became, for the 1950s, Sharpeville actually became the epicenter, of the 1950s movement. And therefore it enjoyed, that kind of an attention. But what happens between 1960 and 76? No doubt. I mean, the next epicenter becomes Soweto, and Sharpeville actually gets to be in the background. You can see this by the ways in which the distribution of the June 16 detachment. Fewer of them actually come from Sharpeville or from Sebokeng, precisely because the area wasn't as affected as Soweto would have been. But then come 1984, yet again Sharpeville comes to the picture. And here we have to start explaining, what is it about Sharpeville and Sebokeng in particular, that leads to that eruption that happened on the 3rd of September 1984. Now, more than anywhere else, the Black Local Authorities Act was enforced more vigorously in Sharpeville and Sebokeng and Wipato. Not that it wasn't enforced elsewhere. They were enforced here in Soweto on the East Rand. But the situation in Sharpeville and Sebokeng was far more intense, than anywhere else during 1984. But finally, Ntiki, something else about Sharpeville and Sebokeng is that both, not so much Sebokeng, but Sharpeville, is that it was a stronghold, of the PAC. Sharpeville and Everton, actually. They were a stronghold of the PAC from the 1950s. If you think about it, one of the, greatest, stalwarts of the PAC was David Sibeko. And David Sibeko actually came from Everton. Now, anything associated with Boko was actually looked upon with a kind of surveillance that would have exceeded any other. So it is all these elements that come together, and make the wild townships, the kinds of unique Black townships that they would have become. And it is interesting, that just in terms of, and this is in the nature, of resistance to white supremacy in South Africa over the years. In one moment, you may have localized, kinds of uprisings, but Sharpeville has been able to produce the kind of an uprising that reverberates, across South Africa. And it did that twice, in 60 and in 1984. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, it's because of the PAC stronghold. Now I understand. Thank you.
And the Poko element, Ntiki, is absolutely critical.
Yes, now it makes sense. It's part of the erasure. Now we understand. So it means that we have to have more programs around Sharpeville and bring about that memory to show the importance of Sharpeville in our history.
Precisely. And, the one thing, and here I think we again here, a degree of frankness is actually required. There is no doubt, that it was not in the interest of the Congress Alliance, to have a situation where the Black radical tradition, was going to be defining the struggle for liberation in South Africa. And you see this in very many ways, and the ways in which, the struggle would have been, I know using this term is rather, cynical, but manipulated in very many ways. But, if you think about the fact that, the June 16 detachment would have come out of a particular political tradition, and that tradition, whether it was wrong or right, is an entirely different matter. But this is a tradition that would have believed, in the fact that once they were, adequately armed, they could do to white society, what the police and the army were doing to Black society in Soweto, in the 1970s. If you want to argue with that, It may well be that black liberation struggles are expected to be, and this is a philosophical kind of question, that the question of violence in terms of pursuing a black liberation struggle is unjustifiable because just in terms of what it stands for, it is supposed to be morally and ethically upright, and therefore not to be able to justify violence at all. So in a sense, yes, Sharpeville would conjure up those kinds of perceptions about the liberation struggle, and that explains why it would have been played down in the way it was. But it's tricky also. What about Soweto? Is it that Soweto was a lot more moderate and therefore it was getting more attention? And this is important. It is important to understand the ways in which, Soweto was just like Sharpeville, in terms of the white supremacist securocrats and their way of thinking. Soweto would have been considered to have been just as black radical, as Sharpeville would have been. But the issue here is that in the 1980s, Soweto and Sharpeville then demonstrated a completely different kind of ideological orientation. And that is what we need to explain. If Sharpeville was a black radical hotspot in the 1950s, what then explains that paradigm shift, for the township to be steeped in the tradition of Ukongoloso or the Congress tradition, in the 1980s? There are many explanations for that. And those explanations may also, impact on our understanding of the state of emergency, because this is the 1980s that we are talking about. The fact that, Soweto and Sharpeville in the 1980s, had actually undergone a paradigm shift from being hotspots of black radicalism in the 1970s to becoming the terrain of the Congress tradition in the 80s. Naturally, this would have to do with the absence, the palpable absence of a black radical political movement. And the question becomes, how do we account for that? How do we account for the absence of a black radical political movement, that could have resuscitated the black radical tradition of the 1970s? And to explain that would be to explain the fortunes and misfortunes of Azapo, of black student formations at high school level that would have been loyal to the black radical tradition of the black consciousness movement. Both, in fact, also in the universities, you needed to have, a kind of a black political movement in the universities that would not be a Congress aligned, kind of political movement. But there was a complete absence of that. And instead, you had the Congress tradition displacing the black radical tradition. And the question then becomes, how do you account for Azapo's absence, in that particular political terrain? There are so many factors. I mean, particularly, in this period, P.W. Botha bolstered the trade unions to start with, and that effected a shift just in terms of the ways in which people understood exploitation and oppression. But that's a discussion for another day. Then in 1982, something that undermined Azapo philosophically and ideologically was in fact the death of Neil Agat, because the debate at the time was that there was a need to resuscitate an exclusively black political movement at the time when the forces were moving towards, the charterist kind of thinking and the kind of non-racial Congress type thinking at the time. And what then happens is that out of the blue, the white supremacist securocrats give the liberation, or in fact bequeath, a white martyr, uh, and Neil Agate is actually, murdered in detention. I always argue that there is no way that Neil Agate could have been a threat to state security that could have justified that sort of an outcome. It may well be that, in their own, kind of private world, he may have been understood to have been such a threat. But I still felt it was a figment, of their imagination. But the impact it had, and this is the thing, we hardly ever talk about the impact that Neil Agate's death would have had on the Black radical tradition. And I know, I'm trying to account for the fact that Azapo was being undermined, progressively by the kinds of things that were happening. And this would explain, the ascendancy of the Charterist tradition over a Black radical tradition. Now, it is 1982, when this thing happens, when Neil Agate actually, gets killed in detention. And already it is beginning to impact, quite significantly on the political discourses that are going on inside the country. And surely, when Azapo holds its 9th General Conference, there's a major walkout. And this walkout is initiated by those that are calling for, a kind of non-racial kind of twist and a move away from the Black radical tradition of the 70s. And this is a big blow, to the Black radical movement of the time. And in 1983, they actually established the United Democratic Front, of all places, in Mitchell's Plain in Cape Town. Now, that actually demonstrates how alienated, a lot of those Black radical hotspots would be, to the movement of the 1980s. But the issue here is that the Charterist movement also inherited, the hotspots of the 1950s and 1970s Black radical movement, Soweto and Sharpeville. Now, the IFP, I was actually at that point, explaining that the IFP actually would have started the popular violence. But the point I'm actually making is that just in terms of historical orthodoxy, the Ngwaya massacre is excluded from the popular violence of 1984 to 1993. But it needs to be added because I pointed out that you need to explain why, the IFP stroke the KwaZulu Territorial Authority decided to enter what, in fact, at the time was quite clearly a national political landscape. And that was the issue. That was the point about the Ngwaya massacre. It was actually to establish a footprint for the IFP within the national political landscape. And, both of them becomes one indistinguishable from the other. When it suits Buthelezi, he would say, hey, we're acting as part of the KwaZulu Territorial Authority and therefore the king, which is pretty much his explanation for the Ngwaya massacre, that this was not an IFP event. It was a Zwelithini event because it was Cetshwayo's birthday. But the issue here is that this was a positioning, of whether you want to call it the Zulu identity or the IFP, but this was a positioning for a future kind of political dispensation. You may well ask, how would they have told that ultimately there was going to be negotiations? There's no doubt, that someone like, Buthelezi would certainly have been privy to the fact that, and again, this actually is an issue that came up from time to time, that in actual fact, the MK and the armed struggle were not going to be sustained over, quite an extended period of time. I mean, you've had people from time to time actually expressing this view, both outside the Ankh and inside the Ankh. And outside the Ankh, well, justifiably so, people would argue. C.S.G. Mashinini made that point. And he probably was making the point not having had sufficient knowledge. But I have spoken about Tennyson Makiwane, and Tennyson Makiwane was one of the Gang of Eight who were expelled from the Ankh in 1975. And again, here it's got to do with black radicalism, because the one issue about Tennyson is that he was at one with the Africanists in the 1950s about their discomfort with the Congress alliance, and the involvement of non-Africans, in the ANC. But he stayed inside the ANC beyond the formation of the PAC in 1958. And after the Morogoro Conference, in fact, at Morogoro Conference and after, he and the other seven were steadfast, about their displeasure, particularly yet again, with Yusuf Dadu, whom they felt was actually manipulating Oliver Tambo at all times. Now, I do know that, the kind of romanticization around Oliver Tambo, that has gone on. And it is unfortunate, that there has to be a counter-orthodoxy that is actually based on historical facts. The issue here is that, at least, in the eyes of the Gang of Eight, Oliver was actually being manipulated mainly by Yusuf Dadu and probably to some extent, by Joe Slovo himself. But be that as it may, the romanticization of the Ankh and of OR would probably, have something to say about that. But that would have been, quite realistic. So Tennyson Makiwane came out in 1978. They were expelled in 1975. And in 1978, they formed first after expulsion, what they referred to as the ANC of Azania. And he and the other seven. But they did get, some support from some of the exiles in Lesotho, for instance, who were also quite unhappy, about the situation, despite the fact that in 1976, the Ankh was actually rejuvenated by the June 16, the class of 76. But there was a sense still in people like Makiwane that this was going to be unsustainable. And in 1978, Makiwane actually went to Lesotho, and this was a kind of perfect timing for him. This was at the same time as the United Nations Human Rights Commission held its conference in Maseru. And, Makiwane turned up. He was quite known, in United Nations circles. He was actually one of the founders of the anti-apartheid movement in London. And he was able to diplomatically, set up the ANC in very many places. In fact, according to Paul Trewiller, who also was an exiled and a member of the SACP, Tennyson Makiwane was regarded as the Prince Imperial of the movement. And in 1978, he turns up in Maseru and he starts writing pamphlets. And all these pamphlets were quite, scathing in their attack on OR. Talking about how jet set he is, always having a passport clutched at the back of his pocket, ready to fly out to some exotic destination. And that's unfortunately, this was a pamphlet. And, one wishes that they could have kept it. But that's what he did. And he took that opportunity and was able to meet a delegation from the Transkei. And this, is quite, indefensible, because what he did next was to ask for amnesty and to return to the Transkei. And he started serving the Transkei government. Now, this was a man who was a stalwart of the Ang in exile. And also before he left, he was one of the leaders of the Alexander bus boycott of 1957. So Makiwane was no small fry. He was quite high up, in terms of ANC leadership hierarchy. So he went back to the Transkei and started working as a roving ambassador of the Transkei, selling the Bantustan state, wherever he could, and putting the argument that they were an independent state wherever he could. And no doubt, Oliver Tambo felt that he was a sellout and that he had to be taken out. And yes, in 1980, an MK cadre crossed the country and went into the Transkei and removed him. So this is the second person who was saying, Ang's armed struggle was going to be unsustainable. But then, you have the Nkomati Accord, which really underscores, this kind of a thinking and assertion. Because although Michelle didn't say much about this, a great deal of the writings and reflections on the Nkomati Accord actually came from the Ang and from other people inside South Africa. But from the Mozambican point of view, this had pretty much to do with the fact that, MK and Ang had become quite ineffective, while at the same time Mozambique had to put up with Renamo that was backed by the South Africans. So they had to, come to the Nkomati Accord agreement. And as I pointed out, that actually, threw the Ang into a complete disarray in Mozambique. And hence Botha could comment that his total strategy may have been imperfect, but that it worked. Now, here's an interesting article from a Professor Lawrence Schlemmer, which was quoted in the Sowetan in 1985. And, this is something that needs to be looked into because it also explains, the situation around the state of emergency in 1985. The article actually appeared in 1985. Lawrence Schlemmer was head of the Center for Policy Studies. This was a liberal think tank, which was linked to some extent to the Institute of Race Relations kind of thinking, and the kind of progressive liberal party of the time of Helen Suzman, kind of liberal domain. And Schlemmer looked at the Ang, and this is what he had to say about it, and probably about P.W. Botha as well. That from 1978 up to 1985, the one thing that was consistent about the Nationalist Party is that it yearly increased the defense budget because it always pointed to the fact that there was a total onslaught, awaiting to be unleashed by the Ang. And according to Schlemmer, he says, and Botha knew that this was not true, that he was doing this merely, to get a lot of money that they actually squandered, within the defense, establishment, because Botha was Minister of Defense. And when he became Prime Minister in 1978, he still retained the position of defense until 83, when he handed it over to Magnus Malan. So what you had here was an, kind of defense, kind of establishment, that was having a good time, having access to the budget and slash funds. In fact, a recent book has exposed how these guys, had an island to themselves, the Bed Island, where they would take young boys and do all sorts of, nasty things to them. But it just goes to show the kind of, corruption that was there. And Schlemmer actually refers to this. But what he says ultimately is that in that period from 78 to 85, what P.W. Botha was doing was, socially engineering a kind of a militarist state so that by 85, to all intents and purposes, South Africa was a military junta. This is why he could quite easily, institute a state of emergency without having to substantiate it in any parliament at all, because the parliament had become a dead duck. And Botha was running the country with his military, kind of, as a military kind of establishment. And this is where your Stratcom comes in. Unfortunately, we should actually make time and talk about Stratcom, because Stratcom was actually linked to the SADF in full. It is, in fact, the Military Intelligence Directorate of the South African Defence Force. Now, what this actually meant is that it was through Stratcom that the army, the SADF, was able to penetrate civil society formations. And what are those? State-owned enterprises. That you found the army interfering in all of those. And that includes, and particularly important, was the the SABC. Stratcom was quite influential in running the programs at the SABC. So that's the issue. This is the situation leading up to 1985. You have
that is Steve. Can we have the episode on Stratcom? I didn't want to disturb you there. That is a very important topic. Stratcom and the use of information and propaganda. We would love an episode on that.
Yes, unfortunately, yes, we should have an episode on that. But unfortunately, again, people should prepare themselves for this. Stratcom is quite significant in the Stompie Sipe affair, and how disinformation was actually being used at the time, and how disinformation was again used quite recently. And we should actually, set aside a time and talk about it. Yes, I agree. How much time do we have?
We got lots of time.
Okay.
Feel comfortable.
Are there any other issues?
No, we are all listening. We are enjoying the lesson. Thank you. I'm so glad you brought up Stratcom. That's so important, that one.
Yes, yeah. No, we'll get back to that. So part of what we are looking at here, is what actually happens leading up to 1985, and already, you have that popular violence breaking out in the Vaal and beginning to spread throughout the country. But there are several others, that happen elsewhere. And the most important among these is actually what happens in Uitenhage on the 21st of March, 1985. There was a funeral of, 7 people who had been shot earlier, and people were going to that funeral. But the police came, and yet again, more people were shot, and 21 people, I think, were shot and killed, and most of them were shot from the back. Now, that was on the 21st of March, and this is, leading immediately to the state of emergency, which was passed in July on the 20th, of July. But there are other events of 1985 which were quite important. And one of these is something that you can relate to. People don't seem to understand what the purpose of Concert in the Park was at the beginning of 1985. Again, this was a response to what had happened in the Vaal townships of Sharpeville and Sebokeng. There was concern that early in 1985, people should be made to forget, about what happened at the close of 1984. And, one of the things that happened, a kind of a distraction, was to put up a major show at Ellis Park in the hope that, after the show, the whole unrest would subside. But that, as we now would know, that wasn't the case, and it is for that reason that people have to understand that that concert was politically motivated. Not only in that, but in sports as well, a lot of things that were happening that we need to talk about, and probably actually set aside a day just to talk about the ways in which PW weaponized sports as well, to entrench white supremacy in South Africa. Okay, but then by the time you get to July 1985, already, and this is why I said we need to now focus on the Far East Rand township of Duduza. A major unrest actually broke out in Duduza, and the cause of it, was while it was the enforcement of the Black Local Authorities Act, and that enforcement would be seen in a number of ways. The rentals were being increased, and families were being evicted out of their homes with nowhere to go. And this was becoming a particularly serious problem. But Duduza has this other dynamic about it. It is situated next to a major, manufacturer of tractors, John Deere. And John Deere happened to be the largest employer of people coming out of Duduza. So part of what you have here is that there are community kinds of concerns that people are raising against the minister at the time, Piet Korenhoff, and that becomes quite an ongoing antagonism between him and local structures, civic associations. But these are tied up, to what is happening in the workplace. And there's also a major power plant of Escom nearby. And all these three come together because there are workers' issues, both at Escom and at John Deere, and they come together with community issues in Duduza. And a major, unrest actually breaks out, leading up to July 20, 1985. Now, it is in that context that the security police decide to intervene, and they actually send Nofomela and Joe Mamasela to Duduza. And, they come up and pretend to be some MK cadres, who were being deployed back inside the country. And they were looking for young guys that they could train so that they could undertake some sabotage operations. And this is where they actually meet up with Makis Kosana. And, apparently one of them actually establishes quite a close relationship with her. And she introduces these two young guys who were involved in community activism at the time and who were also involved in, youth activism. I personally happen to know one of these guys. He was a student in 1983 at the University of Zululand. But following the Ngoye massacre of 1983, I personally never went back to Zululand. So I'm not too sure whether he was able to go back there or not. But he was actually involved in Duduza as a kind of a community activist. Now, Makis Kosana connected these guys, plus this one known to me from Ngoye, to Mamasela and Nofomela. And these guys promised to supply the three young men, with explosives that they were going to attack the Eskom power station with. And they did, supply the young men with these explosives and showed them how to operate them. Except that in the process, they actually booby-trapped, these explosives. And once these guys took out the pins, they exploded in their faces, killing all three instantly. Now, you can imagine what the emotions were like in Duduza. And when people wanted to find out, but who was responsible, who came, with these explosives, it was Nofomela and Joe Mamasela. And they had vanished. But it became known Makis Kosana was in fact the go-between. Now, leading up to the funeral, there were talks, that she has to be dealt with. And on the day of the funeral, well, close relatives advised her not to go, but she felt that, look, I'm innocent. If I don't go, it will it will prove the point. I'm innocent, I'm going, let what happened happen. And we now know, that she would become the first necklace victim, of that popular violence. Uh, that is the extent to which, people were angry in Duduza over it. But then we had the TRC, and Mama Sela and Nofomela quite admitted that Makis Kosana had no idea, that they were Askaris at the time, and that it was unfair that she had to be executed in the way that she was. But here is my, uh, brief comment on it. I really do not think people understand the enormity, of the crime committed against Makis Kosana. I have been trying to explain how the Black radical tradition over time was being undermined both by the white supremacy state, but quite surprisingly, by the most powerful liberation struggle formation as well. It was also in their interest, that the Black radical tradition should die. So I have been talking about, quite a number of historical moments when the Black radical tradition was undermined. But I don't think, for now, the now generation can relate to the impact that this would have had on the generation of 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 76, on the class of 76. Precisely if you think about the fact that deeply embedded, in the subconscious of that particular demographic was this, and I've said this before: no political objective is worth pursuing if you have to visit violence on another black body to realize it. Now, a lot of the violence that was taking place along the way, each one of them was an attack on the black radical tradition. But there was always hope that at some point, there would be a pause and there would be a reflection on what black on black violence actually meant. But when the Makis Kosana episode actually unfolded, it is at that point that one would have felt that was the moment when the black radical tradition of the 20th century almost had its last gasps. There was no hope of ever retrieving it. But here's something else that's quite interesting. Even beyond the TRC and well into the 2000s, we haven't been able to theorize, the whole Makis Kosana episode. It is as if it is just one of those. It isn't. It is significant in very many ways, more than anything else. It is also significant in ways in which we can historically, try to understand the scourge of GBV today. We can be able to historically reflect on that moment and start asking critical questions, about what it meant. But be that as it may, Makis Kosana is actually necklaced on the 20th of July, 1985. That is on the same day that P.W. Botha institutes the first state of emergency in 1985. And this is interesting. Was it instituted as a reaction to it? Well, the truth is that at the end of the day, at the end of the Makis Kosana episode, South Africa was actually in shock. And the one person who was able to really project that shock was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, because he arrived at the scene after it had happened. But he was able to take in what he had seen, and it really shook him to the foundations. Now, the issue here is what happens after the state of emergency is instituted. If we take the first, 5, 6 months, up to March of 1986. Within that period, from July up to March 1986, more than 572 people were killed. No doubt more than half of them were killed by the police. And now this was in different places. The whole popular violence had spread to other places, outside of the PWV area. Uh, there was a great deal of unrest in the northern provinces as well. But there it was a completely different kind of unrest that was happening. And this was in 1986, up to about March 1986. And on the 5th of March 1986, P.W. Botha felt confident enough to lift the state of emergency. But then on the 12th of June 1986, the state of emergency was reinstituted. And this is important. The 12th of June was only 4 days away from the 16th of June. And the 16th of June 1986 would be 10-year anniversary of the 1976 uprising. And already there was a great deal of restlessness in white society about what was going to happen. And a year earlier, Oliver Tambo had come up with a statement that makes South Africa ungovernable. And there was certainly an upsurge, of violence leading to the 16th of June, 1986. And indeed, on the 16th of June of 1986, that violence erupted once again. And the state of emergency was to be put in place until 1990. So all of South Africa, nearly all of South Africa for 4 years, was under the state of emergency. But it is the events of 1986 to 1989, that are particularly important because in very many ways, they would actually prefigure what would happen leading to the negotiations. It would appear that precisely what happens during that period, that South Africa actually entered into the state of ungovernability, if you like. Now, the one thing that actually happens is that there is a complete breakdown, after the second state of emergency. And the breakdown first happens, in the high schools. There's a complete breakdown of schooling. And learners in high schools are adopting what they refer to as freedom now and education later. And just about all townships, in the major metropolis are actually affected by this new development. But along with this, you have now the IFP coming into the picture. And we have to understand the ways in which the IFP was able to then, penetrate the urban areas, particularly the urban areas of what was then the PWV area, now Gauteng. And it is particularly in those hotspots on the East Rand, in the Vaal. And Soweto had also, risen up at the time. But like I said the last time out, past political upheavals would definitely have a political content about them. But there was something about this political upheaval that opened itself up, to other forces other than political forces, and those forces actually shaping the historical moment. Now, one of the things that actually happened, now that we have the IFP in the urban areas participating in this political contestation, the question is, how do they come into it? No doubt, the hostels are still becoming, the base for IFP's mobilization. And the antagonism, therefore, comes from the hostels. And people actually ask this question. that if in the 1970s the hostels were able or were contained, how is it that in the 1980s, the hostels were no longer being contained? And that had to do with the change of demographics in the hostels themselves. Now, in the 1980s, there were new people coming from, particularly from KZN, coming into the hostels and coming from mainly from the rural parts of KZN. And already, this is 1986, 87 we are talking about. Already I've actually explained that the Ngoye massacre of 1983 was in fact a strategic positioning of the IFPF stroke KwaZulu Territorial Authority to enter the national political landscape. So naturally, these two entities would have had a great following, quite a massive following in the rural areas of KZN. And what we are seeing in the 1980s is a new infusion of young men coming from the rural areas of KZN who did not immediately integrate, with communities in the townships. And that in itself, that alienation, ensures that when the hostel dwellers enter the political fray, there is nothing that actually, contain them. And that's the explanation as to why in the 70s it was easier, to deal with those contestations and, through negotiations. Whereas in the 1980s, it was not possible to do so. That's the first thing. But the second thing also is that in the 1980s, already the idea of a Zulu ethnic nationalism, being at the center of the political landscape is something that had already been inculcated. And the University of Zululand, no doubt, was central, in this kind of a project. But the rural areas of KZN would have been, the terrain and, where all of this was actually playing itself out. But the fact that you had, squabbles also within rural KZN, that also had, and this is where you may find in one community or in one village, the one group is backed by the IFP, the other is backed by the UDF. That can be explained just in terms of who was willing to, back which faction. But that would have been an ongoing faction fight that would have gone back many decades. But realistically, it is to the IFP and the KwaZulu Territorial Authority that the majority, overwhelmingly, new guys coming into the hostels, were part of this contrived Zulu ethnic nationalism. And that's the sort of thing that could drive people, to the kind of violence that we saw in Buipatong, that we saw in Soweto, and in all other places where the IFP was actually operating. So going into 1986, the popular violence takes a different, kind of shape here. And the IFP is present in the hostels. But something else that they do in certain townships, and this actually includes Deep Kloof here and in some townships on the East Rand, the councillors, the councillors who were actually the targets, of COSAS, the student movement at the time. They were targets because they were seen as, enforcing the Black Local Authorities Act. Now, they felt they needed, to secure themselves, and they started, looking towards the IFP, for protection. So part of what you begin to see happening here is the emergence of the self-protection units, which were aligned to the IFP. But COSAS and the student movement in the townships also establish what they refer to as the self-defense units. Now, the issue here is that this contestation is no longer, about banning someone. Of course, councillors, whenever the opportunity arises, they are brutalized. If possible, they would still be set alight. But what happens from 1986 into 1987 is that these contestations are now being supplied with automatic rifles. The AK-47 begins to enter the equation. And attacks by the IFP on residents is actually through the use of the same, assault rifles. And the SDUs, are also armed to the same extent. Now, here is a gray area here, that needs to be worked out. And I'm not too sure if, because it is Tula Simpson who is actually looked at the history of MK. I'm not too sure how he deals with, the issue of the self-protection units of the IFP and the self-defense units, that were of the student movement, and how these were supplied, with arms, and therefore escalating that violence to, uncontrollable proportions. But just to demonstrate how devastating the violence was, Wits University had a unit established, which was called the Center for the Study of Violence before they added and reconciliation. But initially, it was the study for the, a Center for the Study of Violence. Now, the issue there was that this violence was becoming so, widespread that it was becoming difficult to pin down and try and, glean what is political and what is criminal, out of it. And from 87 going into 88, the lines were being blurred between the violence that was criminal and the violence that was political. But largely, the violence was in fact becoming criminal. And again, a perfect example here is what happens in the Val. The violence in the Val and around 1986 going into 1987 produces a guy called Khetisi, who actually terrorizes the township. Khetisi is linked to the councillors, and he's doing this for the councillors. And he's known to have orchestrated a massacre at a place in Buipatong, a week or two leading to the Buipatong massacre in 1987. So there you clearly, you see the councillors actually getting the assistance from a criminal, and someone who behaves, in a very criminal fashion. There were a lot of, others of the same kind, where, the criminal violence becomes indistinguishable from, from political violence. But that's where the IFP was actually involved. Then we know about The Line. I mean, a lot of people have seen the film The Line, where Jerry Mofokeng actually plays the leading role. The Line actually demonstrates how, the IFPs through KwaZulu Territorial Authority in an urban landscape, transported that violence onto the trains. And, all those attacks on commuters, that happened particularly between 1987 and 1989. But what we haven't talked about is that in other places, it wouldn't have been the UDF and the IFP, particularly here in Soweto. While there was the IFP factor, there was also, the factor of AZAPO and the UDF. And we have to, again, explain where that actually came from. And again, here, this is where, criminality and political reasons actually blur the lines. Here in Soweto, it was in fact the issue of Amazimzim, which would have been a label given to Orlando location in particular, because Orlando historically has been known to be a PAC stronghold. And it is therefore, by extension, assumed that it would have become as well an Azapo kind of stronghold. Whereas Diepkloof, no doubt, was a UDF stronghold. But what actually triggered this kind of antagonism between Azapo and the UDF, not only in Diepkloof and Orlando, because it spread to other townships or other locations in Soweto, such as Dlamini, Orlando West. And in particular, Orlando West was actually caught up, very brutally in it, as well as Pinkville. But the issue here started with an attack, on an attack on a student by a young man whose family was, in the marijuana business. So already there is a connection here between, what is criminal and what is political. But the concern here was that there was a certain arrogance about the young man who came from this family because it was, quite rich. And that led to, a contestation. And the end of it, maybe let's just get to the end of it. At the end of it is that the students went into the home of the marijuana seller, burned down the home, and in the process found three young men who were known to have been members of a gangster from Orlando known as Makabasa. Now, they had been called upon to come and defend this home in Diepkloof. But unfortunately, they actually didn't know that what they were, coming up against was far more brutal. The end of, the long and the short of it is that three of them were actually necklaced on the spot. And, it wasn't quite, it was quite a sorry sight. That was the one thing that happened in Soweto. And I'm not too sure if SETS will be happy with this, but SETS was caught up in this, SETS Masibogo, that is, and I'm sure a lot of people would know him. SETS actually comes from Orlando, and it would have been by association that he was caught up in this. And at some point, he was actually kidnapped. And, for quite some time, Soweto was holding its breath, not knowing what had actually happened to him. But ultimately, he came back and explained what had happened. Then you had Dlamini, Dlamini, where, you had a Black consciousness stronghold to George Okop's home. And he was secretary of Azapo for quite some time, of the BPC for quite some time. Because it was known, in Dlamini that he was a Black consciousness person. His home was actually attacked and they had to flee the home. They actually left it vacant. And at some point, me and a friend of mine actually rented the place. And I remember we would sit outside, the back rooms and look at the wall that was perforated with AK-47 bullets. But that was a couple of years after 1988. So it was that sort of thing in Soweto as well. Kumalo Street in Thokoza was very popular, and there the contestation would have been between the IFP and the IFP and the UDF largely. And that actually went on until around 1989. But then, Ntiki, I think at some point, when I feel a little more comfortable about doing this, there has to be a process of demystifying the Stompie Pay affair. and really
Yes.
deal with it like adults, because we really need to do that. For today, I think I just want people to understand, where Stumpy actually comes from. I've already talked about, the Black Local Authorities Act, and that it was enforced, although not uniformly, but it was enforced, in black areas, black townships across the country. And Stumpy's township, Tumahole near Paris, was no exception. And those that know Paris will tell you that at the time, and probably to this day, there's a very significant proportion, there was at the time, of migrant labor, people working outside of the town because the town is rather small, no job opportunities. So people have to go out, to either Vereeniging and even as far as Johannesburg, Germiston, and only coming back home over the weekends. So young people had to deal with the enforcement of the Black Local Authorities Act, which explains why Stompy Sipe at 13, had to take the leadership. And I said, councillors at the time, they would use gangsters, but they would also use, vigilante groups. And in Tumahola, they used a vigilante group to try and enforce uh, location regulations. But because parents were generally absent, Stumpy and his young comrades had to, pick up the cudgel and actually get involved. And so they fought with the vigilantes, and it was known that he was actually leading these young men. So he had to flee to Mahule and actually come to Soweto. And that is how he ended up at Winnie Mandela's place. But we shall talk about what ultimately happens, because then the focus, just in terms of the UDF and Azapo, the focus will, shift to Dr. Abubakar Asfat's surgery, where a great deal of drama actually unfolds. And that is where we have to examine what much later Stratcom would have done with that event. Can we reserve that for some other time? And we are now going,
Yes.
yeah, okay. We are now going into 1989, 1990. And it is in that context that negotiations actually happen. But a couple
Now,
of things,
Steve, do you
yeah.
not think we should leave that for next week? Because today's one has been quite information dense.
Pardon, Tsiki, I missed that.
Gary, do you not think we should leave this to for next week? Because today's
Yes,
episode
yes,
has been quite information dense.
yes, yeah, no, that's fine. Uh, but I hope people are following here. I mean,
People are following. There are over 800 people watching and they love the session. I always tell you, I don't know why you always think that we're not interested. We are here.
okay, next week, then let's deal with, again, I mean, the period 1985 to 89 in a completely different kind of way. I think we will also have to touch on what actually happens up to the, what do we call it? Quito Carnaval. And that is important because it is one of those kinds of things. I was hoping that today I would comment on Morocco, Polisario Front, and former President Jacob Zuma, but let's leave it for next week.
Hey, yes, yes. Because you know what's interesting about that is
Yes,
that I saw that is it Banyana Banyana was also playing Morocco.
yes,
So
yeah.
where do we draw the line?
Yeah. But the issue here is that there is a certain romanticization of the act, and their relationship with some of the extreme left-wing formations, is a matter of no doubt. I mean, they would have had leanings with ZAPU, but they hated ZANU, and for maybe for reasons of their own. And they were quite uncomfortable, I can tell you this. The Eng was very uncomfortable about the Irish Republican Army, precisely because their benefactors in the UK would have been enemies of IRA. So they were quite uncomfortable with that. But also, the claim that they were always friends with the PLO is also subject to, some kind of, should be subjected to scrutiny. The issue here is that it was not until 1994, and 1994 is significant because the PLO actually signs the Oslo Accord. And the Oslo Accord was a sellout settlement, in the same way as the Groteskiermen was a sellout kind of settlement. So, these were, six of one and half a dozen of the other. By 94, the ENC and PLO were six of one and half a dozen of the other.
Okay, so then we're closing it there, then I take it, ne?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Ntiki.
Thank you, Pastor Steve. Thank you for your time always. Thank you to everybody who joined in. We'll see each other again next week, Wednesday. Re a leboga, Ntate Steve.